Hi everyone, so this PowerPoint will be a good revision tool for you. We'll go over just the key ideas, a lot of the key ideas really, in Unit 3. My email address is there, so I can't encourage you anymore to send me questions, send me work, send me commentaries, send me essays. Now's the time to really crank it up. You will definitely improve from here until the exam. You will improve massively if you do practice pieces. I think it's really important with our subject to be really considerate of what we're doing. I know that goes without saying, but often you need to be reminded. We're doing English language, looking at language variation, like the whole year is about language variation, how we vary our language firstly to suit different purposes that we might have, and how we engage different registers and how much of an impact the situational context has on a text. And then of course we've spent the last few months looking at language variation, and then of course how when we vary our language we either deliberately construct an identity or we subconsciously might reflect an identity. And I think there's one thing that we have to always remember. We have to remember the concept and the role of standard English. I think sometimes we forget how important that is. Standard English, as we know from the quotes that we've come across earlier in the year, are all about the rules, I guess, the rules that have governed the English language over time. And I think, we sometimes talk in class and talk in passing about, what we think about prescriptivists. And if you're a prescriptivist, that's fine. If you're not a prescriptivist, that's fine. But everyone has views on language. Everyone has views on prescriptivists. And people have views on descriptivists. That's fine. But I think one thing's clear. We have to have a standard. If you didn't have a standard, then, of course, you could have a non-standard. And non-standard is the thing that, we need to be creative. It's the thing we need that can help us promote some kind of identity. I think both units work really well together because sometimes you promote your identity for the sake of a social purpose. So the year in itself, like now that we've got to the end of it, hopefully you can see where it all fits together and where it all tends to make a bit of sense. And David Crystal says it really. I love David Crystal. He says some really great things, and he says some great things about the role of prescriptivists, but in terms of the role of prescriptivists and the need to not have, or you can't have a zero tolerance. You can't be upset at every rule that's broken because rules are broken for a reason. All right. Rules are broken in this particular quote, for example, talking about creative writers. Again, that's about their social purpose. They want to invoke excitement. They want people to enjoy what they're reading, and sometimes you have to break the rules to create that level of excitement. Let's crack into Unit 3, social purpose. It might feel like a long time ago for some of you, but we've spent the last few weeks doing some short answer stuff and some commentary stuff. And, we've done a little bit throughout the year, throughout Unit 4, trying to keep on top of Unit 3. So hopefully it's not too foreign for you. And none of the stuff in this slide is new. All this stuff is stuff that you should already know. The concept of register is something that's really important when thinking about social purpose. And as skilled speakers or as skilled writers, you know that you have this ability to change your register. And you change your register to suit the particular context that you exist in. So we think about informal texts, and these things should rattle off. You should rattle off pretty easily at this stage of the year. Relaxed, familiar. Conversational is a really important one. All right. A lot of the times, informal text and informal language allows the language user, whether it be a speaker or a writer, to create a conversational tone. And of course, we know that that conversational tone helps to build rapport with the listener or with the audience or with other participants within the conversation. Then, of course, the flip side of that is this formal text. They're a bit more serious. A lot of the time they're looking at creating social distance. If not creating, maintaining. There's often someone who, I guess, has more power in the social situation, and formal language allows them to maintain that power. Now, in terms of register, of course, let's not forget the subsystems that we introduced way back at the beginning of Year 11. It was a while ago now, but we've talked about them enough. They should just be second nature to you. Phonology, morphology, lexicology, syntax, semantics, and discourse. Now, when thinking about register, obviously, we know that our go-to move is probably going to be lexicology. Every text has words, so it's the lexicology and the lexicon used within the text that is worth analysing, and so too with syntax. Like, every text has words and every text has some kind of syntactic structures that are worth discussing. Of course, as we go into your commentaries, it's important to also talk about and analyse the discourse itself. More on that later. As I said, it's important to look at lexis, maybe deliberately or otherwise. We use words, we use lexis, we use certain types of vocabulary to lower the register and to produce a more informal language. So I'm sure you remember this activity from a while ago now. You've got sort of 4 words that more or less mean the same thing, but obviously have a different connotation and then a different register. Of course, then we have syntax, like I talked about. In informal text, you're more likely to have short, possibly more like fragment sentences even, simple and compound sentences. When talking about compound sentences, you might want to talk about how it reflects more of the spoken nature, particularly if it's a written text. And of course, ellipsis might also exist. And then in formal text, you've got longer, more complicated sentences, but it's always good to use meta language, so talk about complex or compound complex structures. When determining the register of the text, I think sometimes, especially now at this stage of the course, you'll look at a text, you'll read a text, and you'll inherently know what the register is, but then you need to tell the examiner, tell the assessor, tell the person reading your work how you know. So you need to identify, especially like we've been saying towards this back end of the year, texts are going to have a variety of registers in them. The last few exams, they like throwing in texts that are formal in some parts and informal in other ways. So you need to be able to identify where the formality or informality is evident, work out whether it changes throughout the text, but then even more importantly, have a think about why the register has changed. What's the purpose? Why has this speaker or this writer used a more informal register in some parts of the text and a more formal register in others? So never forget that you need to identify, yeah, sure, the register, but also how you know that's the register. Now that leads nicely on to a quick discussion of situational context. Again, this is what we've based much of our year around, and the question always comes up in class, or more generic questions will come up in class about why something is a certain thing, and so often the answer is because of the situational context, or it depends on the context. So when looking at the situational context of a text, any given text, remember Dr. FMS. Domain, relationship between participants, function, mode, and setting. And sometimes I might change situation for setting because it's more than just the physical setting, it's the literal setting, as well as the bigger picture of why that text exists. Let's take a look now more specifically at informal language. Thinking about the functions of informal text, of course, look at specifically what the text does, whether it's giving information or giving instruction or persuading, but generally speaking, most informal texts are designed to build rapport with the audience, maybe even to entertain the audience. So never forget that, but also take it a step further in terms of it builds rapport because of this reason, or they're building rapport because this is what they want to achieve, or they're persuading the audience or entertaining the audience for these reasons. Remember what we always say, you need to engage with the text and be as specific to this text as you can, so don't be too generic or too general, please. Let's break it down to the stylistic features of informal texts. So if you get asked a question about phonological features, there's a lot that you can be looking for. Obviously in a spoken text, there will be prosodic features annotated, tempo, stress, volume, intonation. In a written text, they still might be there, but it's obviously done lexically or in terms of the way the author spells things or the way the text is designed. In a spoken text, vocal text may be indicated, and we did a practice task recently that involves some vocal effects that they asked you to analyse. Connected speech processes, again, will be there in spoken text, informal spoken text, and may be represented by some non-standard spelling in written texts. The one thing that people might get tripped by, and again, it's not a trap, but it's a very specific question. If they ask you about phonological patterning, then you're looking at things like alliteration, rhythm, rhyme, consonants, assonance, and onomatopoeia. So if it's phonological features, you can talk about a phonological pattern that exists within the text. But if the question's about phonological patterning, it only covers those 6 things. So don't be talking about assimilation or vowel reduction or vocal effects or prosodic features. Only talk about those things if the question's about phonological features. If the question's about phonological patterning, then that opens you up to those 6 meta-language terms, I guess. With morphological patterning, so they might ask you about the lexicology or the morphology of the text. For an informal text, looking for things like diminutives, anything that's kind of rhyming constructions or interesting word formation processes. So there's just things you look for morphological patterning, particularly in an informal text. Word formation processes will still exist in a formal text. Like you may have some initialisms or abbreviations, but when we're looking at informal texts, things like blends, shortenings, contractions may also be there. Probably the most common feature of an informal text is the use of some interesting lexical choice. So things like slang, metaphor, again thinking back to creative word formation if the question's about lexical choice, swearing. We've spent a little bit of time on swearing in this class, and particularly with your commentaries, or particularly with your essays, if you're going to talk about swearing, I'd love for you to go back to the journal article we shared late in term 3 about the tradies and find some quotable quotes from there about the use, the purposes of swearing. Because sometimes it doesn't read well when you just talk about swearing for the sake of talking about swearing. In your essays, if you're going to be talking about swearing, I really want you to support it with some evidence from a linguist of some kind. But your informal text for section A or section B, it may have swearing in it. So you can definitely talk about that as a sign of the lowered register. Syntactic features, again, is a good common one for thinking about informal texts. So non-standard sentence structures, sentence fragments, ellipsis. So when you're talking about compound sentences and the higher level of or higher amount of coordination, you can talk about how that reflects the spoken language, which makes a more of a conversational tone to the text, which then again reduces the formality of the text. And then you think of all the different non-standard syntactic features that might exist within a text. It's important also, obviously, with your commentaries, one of the dot points is stylistic and discourse features, but you also might get a question in the short answer saying to discuss the discourse features of the text. So there are a number of things that you want to be looking out for. In a spoken text, you're looking for the non-fluency features. So these are the parts of the text that are contributing to the discourse of the text. So non-fluency features like overlapping, pause fillers, pauses, repairs, repetitions, false starts. Again, in your commentary, if you get a section B text that's a spoken text, talk about discourse features, talk about non-fluency features. If you get a text that is a written text, and we'll get to this in a little bit, talk about coherence and cohesion. You can, if you want to, talk about coherence and cohesion in a spoken text, but you're better off talking about these sorts of discourse features that exist. Other features include adjacency pairs, interrogative tags, discourse particles. When thinking about discourse particles, though, consider the function of them. They're often at the start of turns as a way of redirecting the conversation or changing the topic. So look at the function of them. They may look like a pause filler, but they might not be. Or they might be a pause filler acting like a discourse particle. So I know that might sound a bit confusing, but what I've said there on the slide, you really have to consider the function of the particle. So you might get asked a question on discourse features, but you might also get asked a question on discourse strategies. With spoken text, you're talking about things like topic management, turn taking, how speakers hold the floor, and then how speakers respond to those with the floor, so minimal responses. For written text, like I said, it's cohesion and coherence. Let's have a talk about cohesion and coherence. Again, we've done this to death, so we should be all over it, and for the most part we are. Cohesion is about how the text sticks together. So I think of cohesion and I think of adhesion, I think of glue. So it's how the text is glued together, how it sticks together. It's also how ideas relate to each other and how the writer uses language to link the text together. At the end of the day, cohesion is really objective. It's either cohesive or it's not. And you can provide evidence to justify why you say it's cohesive. Coherence is about meaning, all right? It's about whether or not a text makes sense. In that case, coherence is subjective because it might make sense to me, but it might not make sense to you because of the cultural knowledge I bring to the text as a reader. So cohesion is about the text sticking together, coherence is about meaning. Let's break it down into cohesion. Cohesion is achieved, and again, I've used the phrase go-to move a fair bit, but your go-to move is your anaphoric and cataphoric reference. But it's also just about the actual lexis that's used. Like, if there's a repetition of certain words, or if there's synonyms, or if there's antonyms, or if there's hyponyms, they all link the text together. Like, if there's a repetition of a certain word, then of course the text is cohesive because it's focusing on a certain idea. Think also about adverbs and conjunctions. They help literally to link the text together. Then of course we have coherence, and I always think, you see the end of the word coherence and you see the end of the word inference, and they should jog your memory. If readers have to infer knowledge, if they have to bring their cultural knowledge to the text to understand some things, then it's coherent for that audience. Also semantic patterning, again, that's really closely related to inference. You have to understand what a metaphor is actually referring to understand the metaphor. Logical ordering of ideas, also the formatting, so paragraphs, subheadings, things like that. The things also that contribute to coherence are, again, your prior knowledge, so like closely related to inference and a reader's cultural knowledge. But even like if you're really stretched for things, you can talk about language conventions or consistency. The fact that adheres to standard English contributes to the coherence of the text. The other thing that's not on my slide is the fact that cohesion contributes to coherence. So if the text is cohesive, it's more likely to be coherent. So that's a quick rundown of all the features of informal language. But of course, that's all good and well to know those features, but you also have to analyse those features and think about the purpose of the informal language. So it's the purpose of the register, how it reflects the purpose of the text. But even more micro than that, it's the purpose of those features within the text and how they go about reflecting the register and therefore the social purpose of the text. So we've spoken a lot about this, but we think about informal language, we think about building rapport, maintaining face needs, supporting in-group membership, being creative and fun. So these are really general dot points, obviously, but you need to think about what that text does, particularly for, say, the relationship between the speakers or the relationship between the author and the reader. Let's quickly touch on face. Now, I think what we really need to be doing is trying to avoid phrases like positive face or negative face, but you can definitely talk about face. Face is about your self-esteem, your dignity. Face, if you think literally what face means, it's what's your external sort of appearance. So when we talk about face in language, we're talking about your self-image, the way you want to be projected, I guess. When we talk about politeness, we think literally about what politeness is, and politeness is about not threatening another person's face. I think about positive face, and I think about dogs, and if there's any pet lovers in here watching, I guess we know that dogs like to be valued by others, included. They like to be approved, and they're looking for that common ground. They want to be in. They want to be in everything, and that's what positive face needs are. A person has positive face needs because they want to be valued. They want to be included. They want that approval. So we use often informal language to build that intimacy, that solidarity, and that equality. And it is about bringing people together and being treated as a member of the group. And there are a number of different language strategies that people use that you can identify in a text. So, and they're called positive politeness strategies. But if you just talk about politeness strategies in the way that intimacy is created in that text, think about the way speakers notice other people's needs and interests. Think about the way they laugh at each other's jokes. Think about the cooperative overlapping within a text, or the in-jokes, the use of slang. Even something as simple as agreeing with someone or expressing common points of view is a way to increase the politeness and a way to sort of tend to people's face needs. Have a think about that. So, in short, informal language, you can go back again and watch and listen to the different stylistic and discourse features, but then think about how they contribute to the purpose of the text, how they build rapport, how it might entertain the audience, and then even more broadly, think about how informal language can encourage intimacy, solidarity, equality, how it maintains face needs, but also importantly how it supports in-group membership. So let's move on now to formal language. There'll be some features in informal language that are also present in formal language, so we'll try and differentiate between the features of formal language and informal language. Formal language, generally speaking, tends to be less ambiguous, tends to be more cohesive and make some aspects of the context a bit more explicit. If we're thinking about the construction of the text, a written text might appear to be more likely to be edited and a spoken text to be more rehearsed, and you'll know that through the lack of, say, non-fluency features, or through the presence of more metaphor and more simile and more figurative language and more deliberate language choices, I guess. If we think about the users of formal language and the creators of formal text, they're more likely to have an understanding of their audience, or more likely to cater to their audience and be aware of their audience. It's all about packaging the message appropriately. That's what I mean about planning and rehearsing. It's all about making sure the message is clear and making sure that the message gets across to the audience. If we look at some of the stylistic features of formal texts, thinking about, again, phonology, we can still refer to phonological patterning. These things, alliteration, consonants, assonance, aren't necessarily just important or just features of informal text. They could still be there in formal text, and what they'll be doing is about, again, it reflects the planned and deliberate nature, but it also might really make a certain point be more memorable. And if we think about some really important political speeches over time, there are phrases that we might be able to recall because of their alliteration or because of the way they rhyme. So these are things to consider in all texts, not just informal and not just formal. Thinking about the syntax, if we sort of compare this to informal language, the syntax of a formal text is probably, they might be short sentences, but there's a reason for that. They're more direct and more powerful, but they also might be long and confusing, and there might be more complex sentence structures or compound complex sentence structures. Think about why the author or why the speaker has included those. Think also about all the different syntactic features. So don't just think about sentence length, and definitely think about sentence length and sentence type, but also think about whether they've used passive voice or active voice, whether there's listing or parallelism or antithesis. All these things are important to consider when considering a formal text. Lexical features. So with informal text you might be looking at slang, but with formal texts maybe looking at more elevated lexemes, which reflect the register, or the use of jargon to really raise the register. And think about what these language features do in a text. Prosodic features are still important, similar to phonological features from earlier. They'll still exist in a spoken text. And now think, again, when we're analysing, so for a section B of the exam, think about the prosodic features. Think about which words have been stressed and why. Think about which words have been delivered quickly or slowly or loudly or softly. And think about why the speaker has done those things. What particular point are they trying to make? What particular point are they trying to emphasise? So discourse features of formal text, same idea as informal. Still looking at topic management, turn taking, how the floor is held, minimal responses. Written text, cohesion, coherence, but then we'll add in information flow as well. Again, information flow is something that is reflecting more of the planned nature of the text. So obviously that's part of formal language. Information flow is one that a lot of students find tricky, and that's statewide. Information flow is about how language users package their information. It's about speakers and writers directing their audience in the right way. Again, that's all formal language is trying to do. It's directing you in a certain way, and information flow, the way information is packaged, certainly contributes to that. End focus. All right, end focus is natural. End focus is what we want in our language. It's all about placing the important information at the end of a sentence or the end of an utterance. So it's often hard to identify because it just seems normal in English, but it might also be done deliberately and stylistically to build suspense, to sustain the interest of the audience. I think that's a really important point about how writers and speakers keep the audience interested in what they're saying. And they may be doing this through end focus. And this end focus, we think about this idea of the principle of end weight, putting the long grammatical heavy structures later in the sentence. Sometimes when I'm working with students, I'll often use the word clumsy for a student's expression, and it might just be because the principle of end weight hasn't really been adhered to. We want to be putting long, complicated structures towards the end of a sentence. Now, front focus obviously is the opposite of end focus, is when the information at the front is important. So even though we say that the important information is found at the end, sometimes you might want to bring it to the front to really give it prominence. So again, it's about moving information that you'd normally find at the end of a sentence just to the beginning. And again, it's just about emphasis. It's just about really focusing the audience, whether it be a listening audience or a reading audience, to really focus their attention on something more prominent. The final thing to think about for information flow is clefting, and there was a practice exam we did recently that had a question about information flow that asked you to talk about clefting, and as I said on the slide there, clefting is about dividing a single clause into two clauses and adding an extra verb in there. So we think about it clefting, and it's it was X that did something, so X is given that prominence. So it was Johnny who ate the chocolate cake, giving that prominence to Johnny, and really, I guess in that instance, throwing Johnny under the bus for taking the cake. Here's another example. Jake answered the phone, and of course you could change that to it was Jake who answered the phone. Again, adding prominence to Jake or the person performing the verb in this instance. Clefting, like front focus, brings attention to the beginning of the sentence or the utterance. So, there are some go-to moves. Again, like in the practice exam we did, look for this. But then the other one is to also think about the fact that now there are two verbs in the sentence. So there are a couple of things to look for if the question asks for clefting, or if the question asks for information flow and you really can't find front focus or in focus. Think about whether you can identify some clefting within the text. Hopefully, like in the past, if there's a question on information flow, they'll give you a really specific part of the text to look for. So it's really good because it's a bit of a time saver, but it really just directs your focus on that part of the text. So again, like informal language. With formal language, it's all good and well to identify features of the text, but we have to consider the purpose of the language itself, the purpose of the text, and why the particular language user, whether it be speaker or writer, has used those particular language features. And again, we think about face needs and whether or not a person is using language as a way of acting more autonomously and trying not to impose themselves on others, whether it's about reinforcing social distance or reinforcing your authority and expertise. Formal language still might be used to promote in-group solidarity, but just in a different way to informal language, but only ever so slightly. If you think about informal language and the use of slang and how slang can create that in-group solidarity, I guess the inverse of that is the use of jargon and jargonistic language as a way of promoting that in-group solidarity. But then the flip side of that is, and as we know, things like doublespeak and jargon itself, on one hand, certainly can create in-group solidarity, but if you're not in the group, then that can manipulate and deceive, I guess, the audience. So there are many functions of formal language. We think about non-discriminatory language, which is often quite formal. We think about politically correct language. We even think about the use of euphemisms and the way that those language features negotiate social taboos. So think about, people don't, again, there's common mistakes in people's writing. People often write, the speaker uses taboos. You don't use taboos, you use these other things, euphemism, politically correct language, to negotiate taboos or to avoid taboo topics. Have a think about that. So in terms of lexical features of a formal text, one of the most common lexical features of a formal text, one that we often refer to is that of jargon, jargon being specialised language. And jargon, like I said before, can be both helpful but also a hindrance, in that we can often have the use of jargon in terms of including people who understand the jargon. But of course, jargon can be viewed quite negatively, because it could be something that is excessively technical and hard to understand, and unless the audience has an understanding of the jargon used, it can be quite exclusive. People are often quite offended by the use of jargon. But then we think about the different uses of jargon. As I said, it does enable members of a particular group to communicate efficiently. It's all about showing that you're a member of the group sometimes, and you know, the person who's using the jargon might be using it as a way of showing their authority, showing their expertise. But it also might be done deliberately to confuse an interlocutor or a person involved in the text. So on one hand, you know, this could be considered as something that's quite positive, this idea of showing you belong. You know, if you're within a particular specialist group using that language, it might be something that's viewed really positively. But it also might be done sort of deliberately and almost in an arrogant way to show that you're a superior person to those involved in the conversation. So sometimes, you know, jargon can absolutely contribute to effective communication, but there are other times where it is not effective. Similar to, you know, and we're about to start talking about doublespeak. Language that is obfuscatory is language that conceals the intended meaning. All right, it's deliberately ambiguous and deliberately difficult to interpret. As Orwell says, it's language that is designed to make lies sound truthful. I love that quote. Designed to make lies sound truthful. And remember this slide from a guy named William Lutz, who tells us all these things about doublespeak. Avoiding and shifting responsibility is probably one of the main uses of doublespeak, and we think about the way politicians use it. Some of you who have used examples in the past about how how doublespeak is used in the field of economics as a way of concealing or preventing ideas to be understood. So there's lots there you can think about for doublespeak, and you know, there's a few Reading Journal articles posted over the last few months and a few articles on the Facebook group that are definitely worth grabbing some quotes from. In your essays, try and find some modern, some contemporary uses of doublespeak. So think about the way American politicians talked about the war in Iraq, for example. I know that's not super contemporary, but it's still more contemporary than some of the examples out there. Similar with euphemisms. All right? Euphemisms are used to promote harmony and to negotiate social taboos. They're vague or mild expressions that are substituted for ones that are normally a bit more harsh. So things like body parts, bodily functions, sex, these sorts of things are often, contribute to many of the euphemisms that exist. If you can find some really, again, there's lots of articles being posted throughout the year on the way euphemisms are used, and if you're looking for extra information, just type into Google the idea of a euphemism treadmill, and I posted an article just this week about euphemism treadmill, and there's some really good stuff out there about that concept, about how, euphemisms themselves, they are vague and mild expressions, but once they become common, they're no longer that vague or mild expression. Then we need another euphemism for that euphemism, and then it just continues and continues and continues like a treadmill. So that brings us to the end of our discussion on Unit 3, and a real focus there on the features of language. And there's a slide here on your mark range or expected qualities for mark range, and we all should be aiming for getting in that high range. All right, so again, we've touched on this a lot in the last little bit, but it's all about having a detailed knowledge of the meta-language, making sure you use lots of examples and evidence. You must use meta-language, all right? If you get a chance to use meta-language, use it appropriately, use it effectively. And then it's also about being a good writer. So when you're responding to your short answer questions, it's still important to have good spelling and good grammar. If time doesn't permit it, by all means, dot points are still fine. But if you've got the time, then write fluently and write well. So that's it for Unit 3. My Unit 4 video will also be posted shortly. If you have any questions, that was a pretty brief. That was a whole semester's worth of work in one video. So there'll be lots that you might still be wondering about, and by all means, now's the time to email and to ask as many questions as you have. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, good on you.